This system is highly accurate because these hydrogen bonds specify what base pair should be put in the copy, but it's also not absolutely perfect. It allows for variation in that mutations can occur. So you can have changes in the DNA sequence. Sometimes the copying is not perfect. The interesting thing is that once a change is put into a DNA code, that change will, from that point on, be faithfully copied, because the organism won't know that that's a change from what it originally should have been. So once you have a mutation, it itself will be faithfully copied until such time as it might mutate again. So once this sort of thing was worked out, it was realized that Mendelism actually fit quite well with evolutionary theory, and the two theories converged into one, which we call the Neo-Darwinian synthesis. Okay, so what is natural selection? I've given you this quote in full because this is Darwin's original formulation of it. Essentially what it is saying is there's heritable variation, and that heritable variation does not variants survive at different rates, such that the chance of survival and passing on progeny is influenced by genetic variability and the ability of the environment to favor some variants over others. And if you've read the piece assigned from Dr. Wood, Dr. Wood's coming from a young Earth creationist perspective, but the paper is a good explanation of how natural selection works. So if you haven't yet read that reference, please do. Okay. Darwin's hypothesis, and as it was presented in 1859, it really was more on the level of an elaborate hypothesis, had not yet really graduated into a theory. This idea, and in scare quotes, Darwin's dangerous idea, that's a title of a book by a philosopher called Daniel Dennett, who's an atheist philosopher. I wouldn't recommend the book. But the quote sort of shows where people went with this. It's been subject to intense scientific scrutiny since that time. And the reason is, as we know in this class, in terms of how scientific progress works, theories continue to generate, or a hypothesis can generate numerous predictions, and then once it's generating enough predictions that are not being rejected, we're in that loop that heads towards the theory. So starting in 1859, this original hypothesis was proposed. A flurry of research has been done since that time, and so far, Darwin's original idea has not yet been rejected. To say that it's proven. Remember, science doesn't deal in absolutes. But the hypothesis had not yet been rejected that, and Darwin's original hypothesis was that all organisms on Earth derive from a single common ancestor. This is now, because we have not yet rejected this hypothesis despite numerous tests and predictions, it has been elevated into what we call scientific theory. So just a reminder of how scientific theory works. That's mostly just so that you have that there in your notes. We've been on this loop for quite a while. The hypothesis is common descent. That spurns off numerous predictions which are tested, and we have yet to fail to reject the hypothesis. So we've come out as a theory, but that theory is not static. It continues to generate new hypotheses, new predictions, based on new observations and questions. Okay, so the question then becomes, fine, I can tell you that evolution is a theory in the scientific sense. You have a sense of what that means now. For the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to take some time to look at some of the lines of experimental evidence that support evolution. The idea is, okay, how well supported is this theory? Not all theories in science are well supported. Some are more speculative, some are more developed. Where does evolution fall out on this spectrum? So we'll let the dead speak first, and then we'll hear from the living. But to let the dead speak, first we're going to look at some evidence from the fossil record, and then go on to living organisms. Okay? So, and I framed these next slides in terms of hypothesis, prediction, test, result, just to emphasize the scientific nature of what's going on. So this is just a review of scientific process as well. Okay, so here's Darwin's original hypothesis. Modern organisms are descended from ancestral organisms through a series of transitional forms. That puts out numerous predictions. One thing that we weren't really clear on in the original discussion of the scientific method is how one hypothesis can generate numerous predictions. Okay? So the prediction is that ancestral transitional forms should exist in the fossil record and should be arranged in the expected temporal sequence leading up to the extant form. This just means the form that is alive today, so the existing or current form. So that's a prediction that evolutionary theory makes. So the question then becomes, well, how do you test that prediction? And you basically go look for fossils and you date them. The issue of dating in and of itself is a contentious issue for some Christians, especially when we talk about young earth creationism. You'll see this as well. We don't have time in this class to get into the mechanisms of how absolute and relative dating is done. However, I will provide a reference on my courses later that deals with this quite thoroughly from a Christian perspective. Okay, so you'll look for fossils. You date them relative to one another. What's the result? Okay, transitional forms exist. They are arranged in a temporal sequence, and the hypothesis of common descent based on that result is not rejected. Now, the issue here is, and Darwin even knew this in his day, the fossil record is a very infrequent sampling of biological life. You can go many tens of thousands of years between a sample, such that you have a fossilized organism. So, when we're talking about transitional forms, sometimes there's an expectation that we'll have a very fine gradation of forms. And in some cases, in some organisms, that's actually possible. They don't tend to be organisms that Christians are very interested in. Things like marine snails, for example, that sediment into ocean sediments quite readily because they fall to the bottom. So in some cases, we have very nice sequences of transitional forms. In other cases, other organisms don't live in environments that naturally lend themselves to fossilization, so the record is much more patchy. But such as we have seems to support this hypothesis. Okay, so here's the proposed evolutionary sequence for one section of the fossil record, or one transition. It seems that tetrapods, so organisms with 4 limbs, things like birds, reptiles, mammals, amphibians, appear to have been descended from fish. So that might seem a little counterintuitive. The original hypothesis is framed usually on comparative anatomy, because that was something that was available back in the 1800s, early 1900s. You could look at existing organisms, look at their skeletons, look at their physiology, and begin to make predictions of how organisms group together in terms of relatedness. That led to this prediction that amphibians, for example, descended from fish through a series of transitional forms. So then the question then becomes, okay, if we look in the fossil record at the right time and in environments that are marine environments, do we see forms that are intermediate between these different states? So here's lungfish, a modern lungfish. If you look in the fossil record, you do see various forms that appear to be arranged in this sort of transitional sequence between different states. So Panderichthys is one. This is a lobe-finned fish. So this is a fish that actually has bones in its fins. Most fish that you know of are ray-finned fish. These are fish that don't actually have bones in their fins, but just have those cartilaginous rays in them, so basically like your goldfish at home kind of thing. Right? There are lobe-finned fish around still. This is an ancient extinct lobe-finned fish, Panderichthys. Acanthostega is an early amphibian, so this thing actually has 4 limbs, not just lobe fins. So the prediction for each step along the way, if this is hypothesized to be a sequence of descent of some nature, the hypothesis is there should be other intermediate forms that sit in between here. Because every time you get a result, you get a point on the graph, you would predict that other forms exist in between them. So you can see as each new data point is put, each new fossil is found, it's instantly generating new predictions in terms of where other forms or more specifically, when other forms should be found.